Marvel's Time Variance Authority, now stars of Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's TV series on Disney+, is a combination of parody, inside editorial jokes, and somehow also tremendous power in the Marvel Comics universe. Operating in null-time, the TVA are literal continuity cops, setting their agents to disrupt anyone messing with the time stream, and returning them to the familiar banality of paperwork and office life that is maintaining all of time. Honestly, looking back, it's pretty weird that until the last decade of Cable and Deadpool stories, comics TVA have super rarely dealt with Marvel's time-traveling heroes, villains, and mutants. That's what this guide will show you, though, the essential history of the Time Variance Authority and the mysterious timekeepers they report to. Today I'll answer, what are the essential TVA and Timekeeper comics in Marvel history? What can we expect from the Timekeepers in the MCU given their past stories, theories and predictions for what's to come in Loki and the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Hey everybody, I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting here. You can find all sorts of reading orders, including picks for the best essential Loki comics on comicbookherald.com. Some spoilers for discussed comics may follow. The Time Variance Authority is introduced in the iconic Walt Simonson run on Thor, issues number 371 to 372, with the appearance of a hardcore Judge Dredd riff in the TVA agent Justice Peace. This sets up the repeated use of various timekeeping agents of the TVA, where you'll have a bureaucratic arm on one side and a police arm of the authority, right? Justice Peace is one of the most well-known on the police side of things, as is Death's Head, who the TVA employs from time to time, a character that creators like Kieran Gillen have used in their run on Sword in more modern Marvel comics, but who shows up, outside of the Time Variance Authority's handiwork from time to time. It's in Simonson's often overlooked run on Fantastic Four, though, where we see the Time Variance Authority detailed and explained. Over the course of Fantastic Four number 338 to 354, we see the TVA for the first time in full, as continuity cops, amoral, business-like protectors of the time stream, more concerned with the paperwork tied to Galactic using an ultimate nullifier on a universe than any of the other implications, right? Their entire rationale and reason for being is just the day-to-day, if there even are days in null time, of, manufacturing and coordinating time streams across the vast Marvel multiverse. Likewise, it's in these issues of Fantastic Four where we meet Mobius M. Mobius, the repeated arbiter of the TVA's policy, designed based on Marvel editor and continuity head Mark Gruenwald. Marvel's first family comes under particular scrutiny following their involvement with Marvel's Celestials and my favorite Doctor Doom vs. Reed Richards battle of all time, making heavy use of time travel technology that occurs in the build to Fantastic Four number 350, again by the great written and drawn creator Walt Simonson. Highly recommended comics there. The mundane procedure of timeline maintenance is extensively highlighted in Fantastic Four 352 to 354. Same for the sameness of the TVA structure and employees, right? They all virtually look identical. Again, they all have identical floating cubicles. Again, there's just a monotony to the manufacture and the actual, business of maintaining time. Big picture, the TVA take themselves very seriously, but from creator Walt Simonson on down the line, there's a nod and a wink to the inherent comedy of trying to keep the tangle of Marvel continuity and timelines perfectly straight. Indeed, the TVA is frequently grounds for science fiction parody, and throughout Marvel history, ironically, they've never been at the center of any real major Marvel storylines. They're always pretty much just kind of these odd anomalies on the fringes. Now, if you're thinking all this time travel sure feels like Marvel crossing into Doctor Who waters, well, Marvel writers would agree with you. Professor Justin Alphonse Gamble is a deliberate play on the Doctor, introduced in a team-up with Power Man and Iron Fist in their issue number 79, and later revealed as an agent of the TVA. The non-Doctor reemerges in Avengers Annual number 22 in the early 90s during the Terminatrix objective. Gamble is a hardcore Whovian parody and an odd reminder that Marvel UK actually owned the rights to Doctor Who comics for a period of time, including short stories written by the likes of Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, although honestly, that's neither here nor there. The point being, Doctor Who, the inspiration of time travel and very timey-wimey stories, as I like to say, in that, perpetual homage to the David Tennant era Doctor is clearly an influence and tied to what we see in the Time Variance Authority. Now, fortunately, years later, in 2018's Cable and Deadpool Annual Number 1, Deadpool does us all the favor of making it known that Justin Alphonse Gamble is a real grade A creep. It's a really enjoyable story written by Bitterroot co-creator David F. Walker, who is one of my favorite comics writers ongoing right now. Gamble sets Deadpool to protect his mother. It's a very Terminator-esque plot, but it turns out she's actually a fellow TVA agent who Gamble had been harassing throughout time. While it's tangential to this storyline, it's all a reminder that although the TVA wields massive power, their agents are frequently motivated by very human failings, such as lust, greed, and overindulgence of top hats. Keep this in mind. The TVA is often tragically flawed, and they're the ones trying to control all of time. Honestly, the most memorable use of the Time Variance Authority in the 2000s is during Dan Slott and Juan Babio's SheHulk 2005 series, when SheHulk is put on trial by the TVA for disrupting the time stream. SheHulk is brought there as Jen Walters. She's working as a lawyer here and is brought in a murder trial that basically involves time travel. There's an instance here where, as a lawyer, there's a murder that uses time travel technology, where the argument being that someone commits a murder, but actually it was self-defense because they murdered the person who would later go on to murder themselves, right? It's all very time travel-y and potentially confusing. While amidst the TVA, Jen Walters encounters a pre-Avengers disassembled House of M Clint Barton and tries to slip him a note about what's to come in those events, landing herself in her own kind of time trial. Jen honestly can't stop herself from trying to mess with the timeline if it means saving Hawkeye, setting up a really strong premise, which is that She-Hulk of Earth 616 is so integral to the timeline that removing her would cause irreparable damage to the space-time continuum. I think this is an interesting thing to think about when we consider, arguments in Loki and kind of how the TVA functions about, variance in certain characters and their importance to maintaining the time stream. How important is a character like a Loki? Apart from Slott's use in She-Hulk, 2000s era appearances of the Time Variance Authority are sparse. Mobius shows up occasionally. For example, he shows up to Reed Richards to enlist his help in restoring a missing 8 minutes during the Marvel Knights 4 series. Despite the fun high concept, for my money, this story is pretty forgettable. But again, I do like the idea of Mobius showing up and accusing Reed Richards of losing 8 minutes of time. The TVA's appearance in Avenging Spider-Man number 17 is generally enjoyable since it's set during the superior Spider-Man era of Marvel with Doc Ock playing Spidey, but again, it's also a reminder just how much of a deep cut the TVA are for most of Marvel history, operating as deep continuity pulls rather than essential components of the universe. When you think about the big Marvel stories that mess with time and space, Infinity Gauntlet, Age of Ultron, Secret Wars all come to mind, the TVA are generally nowhere to be found. They don't actually play much of a role, and I guess the argument that you can make, retrospectively, would be, well, I guess that means those events and those instances of messing with time were meant to happen, but these others were not. It's a tricky balance to sort of thread. The best modern use of the TVA is definitely in the Jerry Duggan written run on Deadpool. In Despicable Deadpool, we find Wade Wilson back to his murderous assassin for hire ways, kicking things off trying to kill longtime comics pal Cable, aka Nathaniel Charles Ascani Rutabaga Summers. A very Dredd-like appearance of the TVA time cops here, leveraging that Walt Simonson influenced justice piece. They step in to apprehend Cable/Strife, and Deadpool makes his way to an actual TVA prison. I find the brief overlap of the TVA, Cable, and Strife, particularly interesting because it highlights the similarities between the Time Variance Authority and mutants like a Cable or Bishop in X-Men comics who dedicate themselves to maintaining, protecting, or preventing certain timelines. I'd love to see these various characters interact with much greater frequency than anything we've seen to date, because I think there's a lot of meat on the bone there. I think there's a lot of potential to see, okay, what are the Time Variance Authority's thoughts? How do they align with the timelines Cable's trying to maintain? How do they align with the timelines that Bishop has historically been trying to maintain? Now, the Timekeepers and their origins technically begin about a decade before the Time Variance Authority appeared in Marvel Comics, and would this even be a history of the time stream without preposterous Marvel continuity leaps and reaches across the decades? Methinks not. We see them in Thor number 243 to number 245. In their debut, the trio of space lizards are known as the Time Twisters, and it's revealed as the story progresses that essentially they are the idea of the Timekeepers whose actions go wrong and actually cause great damage to the timeline rather than ensuring its fulfillment. In this mid-70s fare written by Len Wein with pencils by John Buscema, the Time Twisters in many ways feel like your dime a dozen alien invaders, at least until the story's conclusion, when things actually do begin to get mildly more interesting. Although, to be fair, again, we have Jane Foster with a sword on the cover here, so there's some interest within. After teaming with another time traveler, Zarko the Tomorrow Man, Thor, and Jane Foster encounter He Who Remains, which is also how my wife refers to me after a decade of marriage. He Who Remains is interesting because it sets up the cosmic idea of a guardian of the timeline. This understanding carries through in later works where the Timekeepers are described as the elders are to the beginning of the universe, the Timekeepers are to its conclusion. If we aren't to see personified Timekeepers in MCU's Loki, I would still like to see the concept of He Who Remains played through in some variation, as there's a lot of intriguing potential there. My surprise favorite TVA and Timekeeper story really hones in on the Timekeepers in 1992's What If issues 35 to 39, aka Timequake, written by longtime Marvel head Roy Thomas. Like most What Ifs, Uatu the Watcher narrates, describing all the beings who watch the timeline and look out specifically for out-of-control Nexus events. This sequence also clarifies the Timekeeper's role driving the actions of Immortus, aka the future version of Kang the Conqueror, as their custodian of the timestream. Immortus acts on behalf of the Timekeepers, or so we are led to believe in these comics. Now, working with the Timekeepers, Immortus not only shapes the timeline, but also erases entire alternate realities, specifically in order to take out Nexus beings whose existence threatens the Timekeepers. This is where things get especially interesting with MCU Disney Plus connections, because Immortus' selection for the one true Nexus being is Scarlet Witch, calling back to the storyline of West Coast Avengers number 61 to 62. Immortus plans for Wanda to fail, essentially, and Immortus plans for Wanda fail, and the Timekeepers ultimately use Immortus as the construct for the Nexus powers of the multiverse instead of the Scarlet Witch. Now, in Timequake, the Timekeepers' mission is that of Nexus assassins, beginning with the assassination of an alternate reality Franklin Richards, destined to become a Nexus being in that universe. Given Loki's own propensity for shadow play and assassination, it's not too far removed to envision his MCU character taking on this role of Nexus assassin for the Timekeepers in a similar thread in the Disney Plus series. I actually think this would make a whole lot of sense, where you could have Timekeepers coming to a Loki saying sentences like, "If we are to live, the future Benjamin Richards must die," but of course that would require the introduction of Franklin Richards. Now, in Timequake, in order to stop Immortus as the weapon of the Timekeepers, Uatu the Watcher suggests to the TVA that the easiest option is to sabotage 3000 AD Nathaniel Richards, aka the tremendously mind-numbing somehow father of Reed Richards. Nathaniel Richards' ties to Ramatut, Kang the Conqueror, Immortus, and not mentioned yet here, but from Young Avengers in the 2000s, Iron Lad, right? In Kang the Conqueror, this time-traveling character, you have all these various iterations of that individual throughout the ages. It all kind of starts in a way with Nathaniel Richards, but, this being as timey-wimey as it is, how can you ever say what is truly the start? Basically what I'm saying is technically, Loki could introduce the flipping Richards family with one very direct comics influence. Will this happen? Absolutely not. There's no way. But it totally could, and it would have a very, very clear reference base in What If number 35 to number 39, the Timequake story, which is sadly kind of not digitally collected seemingly just about anywhere, but is very, very fun if you can get your hands on it. Writer Kurt Busiek would follow up on the continuity threads of Timequake in his Avengers continuity extravaganza, Avengers Forever, once more cementing these cosmic beings' ties to Immortus and his own ties to shaping the continuity of Earth's mightiest heroes. It's honestly interesting in connection to Loki's own themes of determinism and free will, in that you could argue so much of Avengers history is shaped and curated by outside hands like Immortus at the behest of these rarely seen Timekeepers, rather than controlled by their own free will decision-making and actions. A major takeaway from all this is that the Timekeepers are not really this benevolent trio of cosmic beings, and just like we see the TVA of Loki Episode 1 remove variance without remorse, the Timekeepers will literally hire out the likes of Immortus as an assassin to prevent Nexus events that threaten their timeline and accordingly their existence. So in terms of where Loki's going, I think it's safe to say he will not be content under the thumb of the Timekeepers the more he learns about them. For me, the most interesting possible role for Loki here would be to have the MCU version effectively replace Immortus and be used as the TVA's assassin for Nexus beings or variants that threaten the Time Variance Authority. While I don't expect we'll go to full-on debut in an MCU TV series, knowing that Kang the Conqueror is coming in Ant-Man 3 in the MCU, I think it's very possible that Loki could plant the seeds for Kang Immortus in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This feels fairly obvious, though, given the nature of time travel at the center of the storyline, and that being, well, Kang's whole deal. What I think is more interesting potentially is that the MCU can still very much bring out Kang in full force with Ant-Man 3, but what it could do here with Loki is effectively have the God of Lies become the God of Time and supplant Immortus' role as a ruler of entire swaths of time at the behest of the Timekeepers. Honestly, the Kang, Immortus, Iron Lad, Nathaniel Richards, Ramatut, on and on, connections are all kinds of confusing. You could do away with those headaches with Loki filling one of those roles and not having as much duplication in the history of Kang the Conqueror. Likewise, through the Doctor Whoification of Loki, all these variant personas and various forms the character can take across the multiverse, I think we could be in store for a very fun Council of Lokis, a Roger Stern-era 1980s Avengers concept used to great effect with Kang, later with Reed Richards during the Jonathan Hickman-written run of Fantastic Four, and perhaps most famously now in Rick and Morty. What do you think is coming next for Loki, the Timekeepers, and the TVA? Definitely let me know your theories and thoughts in the comments here on the video. If you've read these comics and have thoughts, if you've watched the episode, I definitely want to hear about them there in the comments. Thanks everyone for listening. You can support Comic Book Herald and the YouTube channel over on patreon.com/comicbookherald. In particular, I'd like to thank the mysterious benefactors tier here with the shout out. Thank you Jesse W., Megan Getman, Cole Weathers, Martin Lopez, Brent Bowser, Professor X3769, Richard Renz, Verisimilitude, Tara Nort, Ed Mackey, Clyde to Glide, Pinball Drew, Mike Solomons, Matt Mahoney, and John Samander. Thank you for your generous support. I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com, at comicbookherald on social. Look for the best comics ever and My Marvelous Year podcast for more from me, including we're reading right now through Marvel Comics of 1992 as we go year by year through Marvel history. Thanks everybody for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.